and welcome to this lecture from Margins to Memory, Karayuki-san's Lives and Afterlives in Singapore. My name is Yamaguchi Yuri, and I am an MA student in history at the University of British Columbia's Point Grey campus in Vancouver, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. My research broadly focuses on the Japanese diaspora in Southeast Asia, particularly Singapore, in the 20th to 21st centuries. In this lecture, I will trace the history of the Karayuki-san. So, the Karayuki-san broadly refers to Japanese women who were trafficked across Asia to work in the sex trade. The lecture also discusses the Japanese cemetery in Singapore. Established in the late 19th century by members of the pre-war Japanese community as a burial ground for the Karayuki-san, this cemetery later became the principal resting place for Japanese residents more broadly. In the decades following the end of the Asia-Pacific War, it was redefined once again, ultimately emerging as the Japanese Cemetery Park, a heritage site now managed by the Japanese Association and visited by both local Singaporeans and tourists from Japan. This lecture has three objectives. Firstly, to examine the role of Karayuki-san as the earliest pioneers of Singapore's Japanese community and the ways in which they were later displaced by a more affluent migrant population. Secondly, to chronicle the transformation of the cemetery itself from a community burial ground to a heritage park. And lastly, to provide a critical analysis on the transformation of the cemetery as a site of burial to a site of memory, utilizing Pierre Nora's idea of lieu de mémoire to frame these transformations. Nora argues that such sites emerge precisely when living memory has disappeared, and what remains must be actively reconstructed to serve the needs of the present. So who are these women really? The term Karayuki-san refers to Japanese women and girls who, from the late 19th to early 20th centuries, were sent overseas from Japan to work in prostitution. The word literally means those who went to China, but it came to describe women trafficked across much of the world. In his volume, Aku and Karayuki-san, James Francis Warren traces the networks that brought Japanese women into Singapore and situates their migration within broader systems of colonial labor, poverty, and migration in Southeast Asia. Most Karayuki-san came from Kyushu, especially the Amakusa Islands and the Shimabara Peninsula, regions that were long marked by severe poverty, and poor families often persuaded their daughters that self-sacrifice was necessary for the family's survival. Many were tricked or coerced, believing that they would obtain decent wage-paying jobs. Some Zegan, or brokers who trafficked women into the sex trade, defended their activities by appealing to ideas of national progress, even claiming that such enterprises would contribute to Japan's imperial ambitions. The history of Karayuki-san cannot be disentangled from Japan's broader Nanshin or southward expansion into Asia. Zegan such as Muraoka Iheiji reportedly said that they represented a foothold for Japan and served as the emperor's vanguard. In this framing, prostitution was not merely an economic survival strategy but was rhetorically linked to the nation's imperial project. In this way, the abduction and trafficking of women from Amakusa and Shimabara into prostitution intersected directly with the logics of Japan's economic and territorial expansion. By the 1880s, Japanese sex workers were present in most Chinese and Korean ports, though many were repatriated by Japanese consular authorities. Those who remained often moved further south, with Singapore soon emerging as this major hub for the distribution of Karayuki-san across Southeast Asia. Zegan targeted impoverished regions in northern Japan and Kyushu, supplying women to Singapore through a tightly organized network that linked traffickers directly to brothel owners. From the mid-1890s onwards, demand steadily expanded, drawing increasing numbers of Karayuki-san to Singapore and sustaining the livelihoods of the brokers who exploited them and their families. By 1906, more than 300,000 Japanese were living and working overseas, and nearly 10%, over 22,000, were Karayuki-san. By this period, Singapore had become the single location with the largest Karayuki-san population. The trafficking of women expanded steadily and reached its height during the Taisho era, from 1912 to 1926, when Singapore hosted the largest concentration of Karayuki-san. The Karayuki-san often formed fictive familiar relationships within the broader household, using kinship terms such as mother and daughter. These relationships created a sense of belonging, and for many women who were living far from home, it functioned as their only form of family. While Warren admits that the treatment of Karayuki-san by keepers do not appear to always have been harsh, there have been reported cases of extreme cruelty. If we were to follow Osaki's account in Yamazaki Tomoko's volume, Sandakan Brothel No. 8, she was treated harshly by her first brothel owner, Tarozo. However, after moving to a new brothel, she described her new brothel owner, Okuni, much more favorably, recalling that Okuni treated the women kindly and even provided them with meals, such as pork and chicken. She also kept in contact with her Karayuki-san friends even after. The presence of Karayuki-san in Singapore facilitated the growth of Japanese retail shops and businesses, while generating substantial remittances back to Japan. There are settlements first through brothels, then merchants, doctors, and eventually bankers, creating Japanese enclaves called tsitetsu, or Japanese streets, that fostered capital flows. Major firms such as Mitsui and Yakabe entered the market through beer and tobacco sales, while Japanese textile shops such as Koyoma, Mizuno, and Maruto expanded whenever and wherever Karayuki-san communities existed. With Japan's victories in war and its drive to showcase itself as a model of Asian modernization, the continued existence of overseas prostitution was increasingly viewed as a liability. Government officials recognized that the Karayuki-san risked Japan's international reputation, casting doubt on its claims to be an enlightened nation and highlighting its reliance on exploitative practices. By the 1920s, the Karayuki-san were essentially framed as a national disgrace. In 1920, Yamazaki Heiichi, the deputy consul, decided that the timing was right and brought a conference announcing the ban of Japanese brothels in Singapore. Many of the women resisted the ban, some vanishing into private sex work while others became mistresses. Many of the repatriated Karayuki-san struggled to reintegrate into Japanese society, often facing stigma from villagers and younger urbanites who disavowed their sacrifices and regarded them with shame. Their generation, which had contributed to both family survival and Japan's economic expansion, received little sympathy or respect. Not all Karayuki-san were able to return to Japan or leave the sex trade through marriage. Many died in Singapore from illnesses and were buried there. In 1891, the brothel owners obtained permission from the Singapore government to establish a Japanese cemetery at Yio-chu-kang for deceased Karayuki-san and other Japanese residents. The majority of the earlier graves had been erected by the Kyosaikai or Mutual Help Association. During the Japanese occupation, the cemetery also came to include tombstones for soldiers who had died during the war, even though it was never formally designated as a war cemetery. In contrast, the far more numerous graves of Karayuki-san received no public recognition, as Japanese administrators sought to suppress associations between the community's origins and prostitution. Following the end of the Asia-Pacific War, responsibility for the Japanese cemetery shifted several times. In 1953, the Japanese consulate formally assumed management of the site, and in 1957, the reconstituted Japanese Association of Singapore resumed its pre-war role in overseeing cemetery affairs. By that time, however, many of the original wooden memorials had decayed during the absence of the Japanese community. Throughout this interim period, the upkeep of the cemetery fell largely to Wang Yachang, a Chinese caretaker who tended the grounds since 1944. In 1973, new urban development plans brought an end to the burials at the site. In 1983, the Japanese Association attempted for the first time to create a death registry for the cemetery's graves. The resulting book, Singapore's Japanese Cemetery, Picture and Record, is crucial because it predates the cemetery's 1987 beautification and its rebranding as a park. At this stage, the impulse was less about tourism and more about documentation of names and dates before they disappeared. The book does provide more detail and history of the Karayuki-san. It states that the Karayuki-san likely had no relatives close to them and likely were buried in shared graves or mounds shaped like manju buns, which then rotted away with an anonymous fate without anyone visiting. The book states that, at the end, they must have truly been pitiful. Considerable effort has also been devoted to the recovery of individual names and the restoration of weathered gravestones. The volume explicitly frames this work as an ethical responsibility, remarking, "If we cannot recover what is written on the graves, I feel a deep sense of remorse toward the person resting there." According to the author of the foreword, Higuchi Naoki, it was more appropriate for members of the Japanese community to assume responsibility for documenting and preserving the graves as an act of cultural and historical stewardship. In 1987, to mark its 30th post-war anniversary, the Japanese Association renovated and beautified the cemetery with support from its members and Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At that time, it was formally renamed the Japanese Cemetery Park and opened as a public space. As we examine the Japanese Association's publications and signage within the cemetery since the 1980s, Pierre Nora's concept of lieu de mémoire, sites of memory, becomes useful. The Japanese cemetery no longer functions merely as a burial ground. It has become instead a symbolic repository for the memory of the pre-war community. According to Nora, lieu de mémoire occurs at the same time that an immense and intimate fund of memory disappears, surviving only as a reconstituted object between the gaze of critical history. They send us at once to history's most elementary tools and to the most symbolic objects of our memory, to the archives as well as to the tricolor, to the libraries, dictionaries, and museums as well as to commemorations, celebrations. These sites of memory are fundamentally spaces that can be reconfigured and reconstructed to serve the needs of the present institutions and narratives. This is an illustrated map of the Japanese cemetery, published in 2007 by the Japanese Association of Singapore. It is titled Nihonjin Bochi Kouen Teku Mappu, or the Japanese Cemetery Park Walking Map, and a copy is displayed in the cemetery in Japanese and English. The map foregrounds not only graves, but also natural and cultural landmarks, such as the lychee tree near the Mido. In doing so, it presents the cemetery as a tranquil heritage site with emphasis placed on scenery and selected points of historical significance, rather than detailed discussion of any one grave or figure. On the map is an excerpt on the Karayuki-san, which states, "Since the Meiji period, young girls from poor Japanese homes came to work in Southeast Asia in large droves. These women were called Karayuki-san. Many of them perished in Singapore." So the map's soft, cartoon-like illustrations include politically sensitive figures such as secret agents and even the field marshal of the Japanese Imperial Army, incorporating them into the cemetery's broader narrative of heritage and history while not really lingering on the controversy. The Karayuki-san, however, do not have any illustration. Perhaps because their faces and lives can no longer be recovered, they appear only as a category rather than as individuals. They are acknowledged as part of the cemetery's history but remain elusive as faces, names, and persons. Now, the signage, which was written entirely in English, detailed the history of the cemetery. It states that the cemetery was established for young Japanese women who died in destitution. It then goes on to explain that this cemetery park, which is the largest in Southeast Asia, tells us the history of Japan and Singapore. This signage also notes that the British colonial government granted permission for the establishment of the Japanese cemetery before it moves directly to 1915, when the Japanese Association took over its management. Very little attention is given to how the cemetery was maintained prior to the association's involvement. Since 2022, the Japanese Association of Singapore has uploaded newsletters of the Japanese Cemetery Park on its website. The first few entries talk about the more pleasant aspects of the cemetery, such as how it has become a popular site for bridal shootings in Singapore. Notably, newsletter number 4 devotes sustained attention to the Karayuki-san. It describes how many of these women were deceived or sold abroad to settle their families' debts, labored under harsh conditions and often died young and in poverty. The newsletter suggests that some women secretly saved tips from customers hoping to remit money to their families in Japan, but they died before realizing this dream. The money they entrusted to companions was eventually used to construct more substantial gravestones as a belated recognition of their lives and suffering. In the narrative of the newsletter, it frames the cemetery not only as a site of burial, but as a space of belated dignity and communal memory, where the marginalized status of the Karayuki-san was at least partially countered by gestures of care and ritual acknowledgement. Newsletter number 54 features the oldest known grave belonging to a woman named Sato Toma. The newsletter provides a brief biographical information on Sato, while describing ongoing offerings made to the Karayuki-san, including prayers conducted by monks from Mount Koya. Although primarily dedicated to Sato, the image depicts 14 graves all belonging to individuals who died between 1889 and 1890. From this photograph alone, it is impossible to discern which marker belongs to Sato. I read this choice of framing as deliberate. The photograph privileges the overall aesthetic of the cemetery over the individuality of any one grave. The focus is on form and the quiet beauty of the site rather than the personal history of the deceased. In this way, the Karayuki-san are rendered as a group rather than as distinct lives. The final page of the newsletter states that in the area where the Karayuki-san are buried stands a large frangipani tree, and the sight of countless delicate white blossoms spread across the earth seems like an offering to the Karayuki-san, many of whom died young. We invite all visitors to the park to see this poignant scene for themselves. So this quote essentially transforms a scene of death and abandonment into one of natural beauty and serenity. The Karayuki-san's violent and shameful past is aestheticized through nature so that the site becomes contemplative rather than accusatory. Visitors are invited to see and feel, but not necessarily to question why these women died young, or what were the structures that brought them here. Newsletters do not provide a single sustained history of the Karayuki-san. They are interspersed with articles on entirely different topics on Japanese businesses and even on Japanese cemeteries in Johor. By situating the Karayuki-san alongside merchants, community leaders, and the war dead, the newsletters create a narrative of continuity of Japanese presence in Singapore. The narrative then turns the cemetery into a community archive where difficult histories can coexist with more palatable or celebratory ones. It is important to note that these newsletters are published entirely in Japanese and circulated primarily among association members. The narratives of the Karayuki-san are therefore directed primarily towards readers who can understand Japanese rather than the broader local Singaporean public, many of whom would likely be unable to access these materials linguistically. For Singaporeans, the cemetery is presented as a symbol of bilateral heritage. For Japanese readers, it becomes a more intimate space of remembrance and long-term community, in which narratives of the Karayuki-san are folded within. In its earliest decades, the Japanese cemetery was an active site of mourning. Today, without the living custodians of memory, the cemetery's meaning is curated by the Japanese Association. This shift means that the Karayuki-san can be remembered or forgotten in ways that serve present-day needs, rather than the uncomfortable truths of prostitution, exclusion, and Japan's colonial past. As the only surviving pre-war Japanese site in Singapore, it is not only a rare architectural remnant, but also the most tangible evidence that the Karayuki-san were the pioneering cohort of Japanese migrants to the city. In this sense, the cemetery embodies a paradox. While its aesthetic and interpretive framing may soften the Karayuki-san's history, Its physical endurance constitutes as an inadvertent monument to their foundational presence and can be read as a modest yet significant triumph. The women's graves are arranged in orderly rows surrounded by landscape gardens and incorporated into a narrative that frames the Karayuki-san as pioneers of the Japanese community. This juxtaposition raises important questions about how the Karayuki-san's experiences are mediated through heritage today. The cemetery's beauty and institutional care contrast sharply with the neglect many of its original occupants faced in life and in death. While the cemetery's survival ensures that they are not wholly forgotten, the interpretive frame risks folding their histories into a consensual, untroubled narrative of community continuity. So, as this lecture draws to a close, we could reflect on how we might hold these two meanings of the Japanese cemetery park together, as a surviving site that gives the Karayuki-san a place in the history of Singapore's Japanese community, and as a space that also reveals the inequalities of gender, class, and empire that shaped why they came, worked, died, and were remembered there.